Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Walking Together. I hope you've had time to read the story of Esther, which is told in the book of Esther. And I pray that as we share it, God opens up fresh understanding of her story, but also of your story. Last week, we looked at Mordecai from this same book. And Mordecai, I said, was her uncle, and he is referred to as her uncle sometimes, but he was actually her cousin. As we read this story, it can be tempting to glamorize it, to Disneyify it, but it was a tough story. If we actually get inside of the life that she was living, it was not easy. It was not glamorous in many ways. There were glamorous elements, but it was a tough thing that she went through. The first tough thing is that she was orphaned at a young age. I think it's evident that she was still young at the time of these events, and she'd lost both of her parents before this time. It says she was raised by Mordecai, so she tragically lost both of her parents. We don't know how, but we know she'd lost them both. That was a tough thing. The background to her story, how she became the heroine of the story, well, the king at the time had a great big banquet to celebrate his power and his success. He summons the then Queen Vashti to come and display to everybody her beauty, and she refuses. So the king and his court get together and they decide that to emphasize the fact that men were in charge and had to rule their household and that male dominance was the way to go, they decided that Vashti had to be banished as an example. Then time goes by and the king realizes that he's a bit lonesome. So being a king, they get together again and his men go out right through the empire and they gather together beautiful virgins from all over the empire. It doesn't say how many there were, but I guess it was a lot. Well, it says that Esther had a beautiful face and a lovely figure, and she was gathered with all the other young women. And again, you can think it's glamorous to be taken into a king's harem, but they would all be in the harem. They would get to go to the king once and then would go to the second harem and might never ever see the king again. Their own ambitions, desires, abilities, none of that mattered. And it might have been a gilded cage, but it was still a cage. They would, not a life that I would want. Lots of boredom. Mordecai, as we went through the story of Mordecai, he refused to do what he was instructed to do. Everybody was instructed to bow to Haman, and Mordecai refused. Esther, all the way through, follows instructions. The first instruction came from Mordecai, and he told her not to tell anybody of her nationality. And she could have said, but I'm proud of my nationality. She quite possibly didn't understand the instruction, and maybe Mordecai didn't. But she complied. She didn't tell anybody that she was Jewish. When she got to the harem, she didn't just say, not doing this, I'm not just a plaything. She complied. She took all the treatments that the eunuchs said she should take. She wore the outfits that they said she should wear. And then it came her turn to see the king. All the young women would have been beautiful, but there was something exceptional about Esther. Now, we read about Joseph, that he was given favour in a similar way. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, but he came to prominence in Egypt. But then when God saw that his character needed some more work, he ended up back in prison. But God brought him to prominence again. And Joseph's comment in Genesis chapter 41, verse 52, he says, God has made me fruitful in this land of my suffering. And wherever you are, it's not by chance. And both with Esther and with Joseph, it was not by chance that they were where they were. And God used their circumstance to develop their character, to develop what he wanted within them. So Esther goes before the king, and she really stands out, and she is made the next queen of the whole empire. She still keeps her nationality a secret. But then the decree goes out that her people are all going to be killed. And again, she obeys Mordecai, and he says, come on, girl, you're there for a reason. You're there for a reason. You're part of the big story. Your story isn't just about you. You are part of the story right from Genesis onwards. You know, we're part of God's story that's unfolding. And they had an effect on the people around them and the people that came after them. And we're part of a very vast story. And we don't always see all the implications. And Mordecai says, you came to the kingdom for such a time as this. When she reads the news of the plans for her people, she cries, she grieves, and then she gets up and she takes her place. And then things change. Up to this point, she has been very compliant. But it says in Esther chapter 4, verse 17, that she then begins to take the orders. It says she starts to command. She commands Mordecai. She tells him, right, you pray for me. Get all the people to pray for me. Get them to fast for me. She asks her maids. She tells them, pray and fast. And then when it's the right time, she comes before the king. She starts to take authority and responsibility, and she assumes the power that's needed to do that. And we don't need to be afraid of authority, but we should never seek it for its own sake. Haman, in the story, he wants authority for its own sake, and power and authority for its own sake becomes corrupted. That's very evident from Satan onwards. Power for its own selfish sake is an evil thing, but she now assumes the authority that comes with the responsibility that she has. And she now tells Haman she's not come under this whole spiritual thing of women have nothing to say and nothing to give besides a pretty face. And she assumes the authority that's needed. And then at the risk of her life, she goes before the king and she pleads for her people. Again, she acts in wisdom, and step by step, she speaks before the king and before Haman. And like the Hebrew children that were threatened with the fiery furnace and ended up in the fiery furnace, they said, we know that God can rescue us, but whether he does or not, we're going to obey him and only him. And Esther goes before the king and she pleads for her people. It says in Esther chapter 8, verses 3 and 4, Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. Again, the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, so she rose and stood before him. Whatever your circumstances today, You ask God, whatever we find ourselves in, it's good to ask God, what are you doing? In the things that go on around us, we can just read the newspapers, watch the TV, see what other people do, see what we feel like, see what the people around us are saying and doing. Or like Esther, we can say, God, what are you doing? What do you want me to do? How shall I respond? And Mordecai did the same. How shall I respond? What are you saying, God? What are you doing, God? What do you require from me? And the requirements for Haman and Esther, they were different. Even we can look at godly people from history, from the Bible, people around us. We don't always necessarily have to respond in exactly the same way, with the same heart maybe, with the same desire to honour God and obey him. But what do you require of me? What are you saying to me in my circumstances? How do you require me to respond? Am I to dig my heels in and say no, like Haman? Or am I to smile sweetly and go along with everything that's required of me? And in both cases, trust God with the outcome. Mordecai's outcome looked as though it might cost the lives of all his people. Things don't always initially go the way that we think. Sometimes it can seem as though what we've done is exactly wrong. But he trusted God and he held his course. Esther held her course. She waited her time. If you're like me, I tend to jump quickly, but she waited until God said, speak now. And she spoke the right words to the right person at the right time and got the right result. With Mordecai, it looked as though it was the wrong result, but in the fullness of time, God's plan became evident. In the fullness of time, God's blessing became evident. And as we read at the end of the book, the whole of the Jewish nation was blessed because of the stand that they took. And God intends to bring blessing to other people through your life, through your responses, through your words, through your actions. Don't ever think that your story is just about you. God has purposes that will allow you to bring impact to those that you have influence with. God's wanting to raise up fathers and mothers, people that will protect, people that will disciple, people that will pray, people that will love. And maybe you will just make a huge impact in one life that will then make an impact in another life. Maybe you'll share the good news with those around you. Maybe you'll go through tough things. Maybe your desires and dreams will be put on hold. Maybe they'll be seemingly ignored completely. Maybe you'll be thrown in prison like Joseph. But maybe God's at work. Maybe even though we don't see the full picture, God does. So let's trust him. And if at the minute you don't understand, maybe you're being made fruitful in the land of your suffering. And we need to trust God because he can make a plot happen like nobody else can. God bless.